Welcome to today's webinar. How serious are the economic challenges facing Canada and what are the options? We'll be featuring a brief interview of Dr. Jack Mintz from the University of Calgary. So welcome. It was only hours ago that the president of the most influential nation in history, the United States of America, initiated a reset of the global economy. The impact of tit-for-tat reciprocal tariffs has particularly riled the markets. I mean, I just saw 6% down in the Dow. The politicians nationally, internationally, and most likely even you. One of the consequences is for every nation, top to bottom, to rethink their dependency and relationship with the US in trade, and for Canada, add security. While Canada and Mexico are not targeted, they are signatories to a 60-year-old US trading agreement and therefore subject to more, I guess it was 6 years old, the more customized tariffs on aluminum, steel, and autos, and more possibly to come. The tariffs have triggered Canada's reciprocal response. This is indeed war. Why is hardly relevant. What is relevant are the consequences that may be profound. Dr. Jack Mintz is an economist at the University of Calgary. He writes extensively for the National Post. He has an extraordinary analyst, researcher background, and is an excellent writer on the Canadian economy. KEI has asked Jack to help clarify just what the reset means and what are our options. So welcome, Jack.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Perry.
For starters, what happened in the Rose Garden yesterday, and then what does it mean for Canada?
Well, I think there's two implications for Canada, but the Rose Garden event is a very significant event. I think it brings to a head the movement towards nationalistic type policies of governments, where we're going back to mercantilism that we haven't seen for quite some time, where tariffs are used to put up a wall to try to protect certain industries. But I think it's more than that, and I can talk about that in a moment. But in terms of the implications, of course, Canada itself kind of did well yesterday. There were no new tariffs put on. Doesn't mean that there aren't new tariffs recently. In fact, there's a 25% from last week, 25% tariff on automobile cars and parts, but only the ones that are not compliant with the free trade agreement with the United States and Mexico. There's a 10% tax on energy and potash, but again, it's the non-CUSMA parts of potash and energy that's sold down to the U.S., which is not very significant. And then there's also tariffs on steel and aluminum that Canada faces. But I think the bigger announcement, I think, which is relevant to the world, is that Trump settled on two tariffs. One of them being a uniform or universal 10% tariff on all countries, which what really surprised people was that Mexico and Canada got an exemption from those tariffs. But that's being applied to imports from all countries except for those that are exempted. And then there's these reciprocal tariffs, which are 50% of the estimated effective tariffs that would drive the trade balance to zero. And I can talk more about that calculation, but it doesn't matter right now. But those are quite high, some of them. I mean, for example, they estimated, and I can't forget, I don't remember all the numbers now, but let's say they would estimate a 60% tariff for a country. I think China was pretty high. I forget the exact number now. But then they would get a 30%, half of that, of the effective rate. And that is probably the reciprocal rates particularly, given the size of them, are probably having the biggest impact in causing disruption in capital markets, in stock markets around the world, not just the Dow and the TSX, but also elsewhere. And we also have to remember the price of oil, which is very important to Alberta, dropped $5 today. And, which reflects, a real concern about a slowing world economy. And so Canada may have been exempted from tariffs yesterday, but it's not going to be exempted from the implications on world economic growth that the Trump tariffs are going to impose on the world and the impact it's going to have on the world. So I think that's I think that's an issue that we're going to have to be facing, because given our exposure to the rest of the world, as we export about a third of our GDP to the rest of the world as a very open economy, obviously that's going to have a significant impact on our own growth. And of course, Alberta's going to feel it, given the significant impact on the oil sector as a result of the fall in the price of oil. So the tariff for us with respect to energy is really minor, but the implications of this tariff impact on the rest of the world is really quite large. I do want to just mention and end with one other comment, Perry, before we go on. I've been writing about this point for a while. In January 17th, I wrote an article explaining the reasons why the Trumpians, as I like to call it, are interested in imposing tariffs. And they had three reasons that were given, and it was in a paper by Stephen Moran, who is the who's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors now, but he wrote this paper just after the November election in the United States, outlining basically the tariff strategy that Trump had. And I'm sure he had approval from people around Trump and others in putting out this paper. And he really argued for three reasons why they wanted to put on tariffs. And I think this is what I find most concerning. The first reason is to drive jobs or manufacturing back to the United States. And it's not just for economic reasons, it's also for security reasons. The argument being that you need a steel industry, you need an auto industry, you need semiconductor industry, et cetera, in order to ensure national security. And so that was, one major reason given, which sort of suggests a very kind of a longer run impact or a longer run reason for why tariffs would be put into place. The second argument that they gave was to raise revenue, and this would be revenue that could be used to help offset the loss in revenues by reversing the income tax increases that were planned under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where they lowered personal income tax rates significantly, but it was only done for a period up to 2026, and after that they were to be phased out under the law, and that was done because of the way the U.S. calculates deficits. They look at 10 years, and they were trying to minimize the revenue costs associated with personal tax cuts at that time that they brought in beginning January 1st, 2018. So those rates were automatically to start going up next year. And so Republicans want to stop that happening. They want to keep those lower personal income tax rates, but it's a cost of about $4 trillion over 10 years to the U.S. economy, and so then they need the revenue to help making up for it, plus spending cuts, which is what the whole DOGE exercise is about right now in the United States, to cut about $2 trillion over 10 years. And so the revenue increase is also important. Now, Peter Navarro the other day talked about getting $6 trillion out of tariffs, which would be about $600 billion a year. I don't think that's happening. But even if they get $100 billion a year, that's $1 trillion that could go to help pay for keeping the income tax rates from going up. So the revenue issue is another one for why the Trumpians want to bring in these tariffs. And that again suggests that tariffs would stay in for a long time, not for a short time. And the third reason is to correct the trade balance. And the argument that has been given, which is in Marin's paper, is that the United States has provided a defense umbrella for the rest of the world that's cost them money. And they've also provided a reserve currency. And there's a Belgian economist back in the 1960s who argued that a country with a reserve currency will end up running trade deficits all the time, because people will from other countries will be buying that reserve currency in order to hold its foreign exchange, etc., and that drives up the price, the value of the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. dollar is that foreign reserve currency, which means that U.S. will be less competitive in selling internationally, and of course ends up bringing in more imports as a result. But that's the argument that was given, and so putting those two arguments, the defense argument and the reserve currency argument, Moran argued that another reason to have the tariff is to correct the trade balance, which is kind of like a payment for these public goods that are provided by the United States to everybody else. That was the argument that he gave in the paper. That actually suggests more of a short-term nature to the tariffs, that once trade balances get corrected, then under their argument, then we wouldn't need the tariffs anymore. So that is the third reason. And so I've always argued for, and I've done a number of presentations to various corporations and others on the meaning or what what the Trumpians were looking for, because I think in order to predict what they were going to do, it was very important to understand their motivations. And so I'm not surprised by yesterday's announcement. And a few weeks ago, or about a month ago, Trump did say that he really liked the idea of reciprocal tariffs. I wasn't quite sure what they were going to exactly do to calculate reciprocal tariffs, but now we see. But you can see that all three reasons really play a role in why these tariffs are brought in, and so now we're seeing the fallout, which is another issue, because we could talk about the economics of some of this, but the Trumpians believe that a lot of the fallout is going to be short term, and there won't be price inflation in the U.S. as a result of it, and everything will be rosy as a rose garden.
Well, we've talked extensively over the course of the last few weeks about the why, the reason, the background, the backdrop, that the U.S. is in trouble, $37 trillion deficit, rising $1 trillion or two a year, and it needed to stop. And that the pullback in defense and the overextension of its economy into other lands, has finally reached a tipping point, and that to resolve it was not likely to bring about nice behavior. It was going to require something rather dramatic, which we're clearly seeing. I'm going to jump ahead, though, and ask about the impact not just on Canada, but it seems to me the welfare state has been a byproduct of a lot of what the U.S. has offered to the world in terms of defense and in terms of the reserve currency, that has allowed countries to use this defense gift that they didn't have to spend. If the U.S. starts pulling back, is the welfare state sustainable as we've known it in these countries where the U.S. used to be picking up the cost of the defense, particularly as the cost of healthcare rise with an aging population and birth rates plummeting?
Well, I think that's exactly right. In fact, I actually wrote one of the pieces I wrote in the past couple months is the end of the peace dividend. And if the U.S. is no longer going to provide a good chunk of the expenditure by the Western Alliance on military goods, and are telling everybody else you have to spend more now. Initially, there's now officially there's still this 2% target for NATO, but the Europeans have already agreed to. I think it's going to be 3% target for NATO, and it'll come up this spring, or it could be 3.5%. There's a bit of debate between the two numbers, but 2% is already out of date. And so when you start reading, for example, Germany is, for the first time, starting to put some very serious money into armaments. And Canada is still laggard, but we're going to have huge pressure now to spend a lot more on the military side. And so if you go back to, if any of you have done economics, first year economics, and if you ever used Paul Samuelson's textbook at that time, he used to have a nice diagram about the choice between guns and butter. And if you put more resources into guns, you're going to have less resources available for butter. And it's simple as that. And that's why I wrote about the end of the peace dividend and the implications of that. And it does mean that governments are going to be facing, um, a lot of pressure now to put more money into the military side. And the problem they have, of course, on the deficits and debt side is they've run up huge debt. In fact, worldwide debt is at levels not seen since the Second World War. Anyway, we haven't had a major confrontation like that. And so we have, a lot of countries are very constrained to try to raise deficits or rely on bigger deficits. The U.S. actually is very concerning, I think, with their uncontrolled deficit because both the Republicans and Democrats don't care that much because they think because they're reserve currency, they'll never have a run on the U.S. dollar, but who knows? Um, and so, and now Canada is going to be facing that. And so that means either you squeeze other parts of the government's budget or you raise taxes. And of course, right now, especially post-COVID, taxes are very unpopular. Countries are not pushing up taxes right now, except for Britain, they did. And now you got a very unpopular chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, Rachel Reeves, who put up a lot of taxes this past year and is now paying the price. So, and that's because of the affordability problem. We had so much inflation the past few years that people, budgets are squeezed. They don't have room to pay more taxes. And
So let's zero
so
in.
that means that we are going to see public budgets being more constrained, at least in the next while.
So let's zero it right. You brought us to the level of the person, the individual, the pocketbook. The reaction that I'm seeing at personal levels, people that aren't talking politics or talking broad economics, or talking about their pocketbook, they're angry. They have come to rely on government to be the answer for whatever problem bothers them. A politician is running for election, making promises year after year after year. And all of a sudden that's coming to an end, which drives an increase in self-sufficiency or an expectation that individuals, not just nations, will do more to take care of themselves. I was joking today, maybe we're going to see more gardens, which is what we saw in the Depression. Um, would you echo that sentiment that this is ultimately going to roll out to what is the individual doing to take care of themselves when government starts to say, we can't carry the load as we once did? Not for everybody. I mean, clearly the disabled and those severely disadvantaged will continue to rely on that safety net, but it seems to me that safety net is going to get thin.
Well, I think it is going to get challenged, but I think if we look at the case of Canada, uh, I think there is room, I think, for some significant change. Uh, for example, with healthcare reform, I mean, maybe at some point we're going to start figuring out that why don't we be like the Europeans and allow for privatization, but a much more integrated public healthcare system. By the way, I'm on a board of Toronto Hospital right now, so and I was once on the board of Alberta Health Services, so I've seen the problems, and they're really quite significant. But I do think actually the system needs more money. But the left wing sort of says, okay, let's tax the rich and the corporations to pay for it, which is not feasible. And so because you keep taxing the same people to pay for everything, and I don't think that's going to work very well. So I think we're at a point where we are going to need some very serious reform. But some of it I think could be quite good in the sense that it'll make services much more efficient. Also, governments have a huge productivity problem. I mean, we've had an expansion of the federal civil service by over 40% since 2015. And are we getting better services? Well, the answer is no. I mean, still a lot of difficulties trying to get certain things done. CRA is, a lot of people will tell you, is not easy to deal with. I've had my own personal experience where trying to use their website and getting onto issues that are problematical. We know that we had problems with passports. I think that's getting a bit better now. But I've seen other things, just even applying for old age security and things like that, the slowness of the system and everything else. So I think there'll be a more pressure on making governments more productive too, and that will require technology, which we have to do that. And so I think we're at a point where there's going to be some difficult decisions to be made. including the way we run our social services, which isn't always effective.
Well, you've zeroed in now on the internal challenges. We know that the U.S. and what it's doing, it brings external forces on this country. But the silver lining in all of this, it seems to be forcing Canada to come to grips with long overdue issues that have been talked about but unresolved in energy infrastructure, in interprovincial trade, even federalism and the role that provinces play in taking care of themselves, as opposed to also being dependent or subject to the whims of the federal government. So when we look at internal reform, you've touched on healthcare, and I was director of privatization for the province of Alberta for some years, not as an ideology, but as a management option when market forces were adequate, that you didn't need to focus on building supply anymore. You could begin to rely on expectations of the market. That's a complete shift in expectations, and difficult for government often to implement without it being somewhat painful. And certainly not meeting the expectations of people that expect government to be nice and to be a service provider, as to be able to regulate markets. So government's role shifts from being a service provider to being more of a service monitor or regulator. Do you see that evolving as well?
Uh, I'm not sure. I haven't really. I'll be honest. I haven't really thought of it in that direction. I'm not sure. I'm not sure governments are necessarily the best regulators in the world.
Oh, that's my point.
And so, and in fact, I think sometimes you end up getting over regulation. You get a bureaucracy that then starts looking for things to regulate.
Well,
Uh,
they've been looking for things to deliver for quite a while.
so,
Let's shift to, let's
and
shift
so
focus.
I do get worried whether that's going to be the kind of solution we'll see.
Let's shift focus to Northern Canada. We have what is estimated at a $3 trillion economic opportunity in Northern Canada, between here and the Arctic. It's huge. It's massive. It's vast in terms of its resource. What are the advantages that Canada has that are negotiable, that give us some leverage in our negotiation with the United States?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the Arctic is important for security reasons, right? And we have done a terrible job in in protecting the North. They, we have an agreement now with regard to refreshing NORAD with the United States that's going to require some money to be spent for sure on icebreakers and of course you can see that Pierre Poilievre, for example, has promised to build a new state, military station up in Inuvik. Carney's even been talking about more strengthening the Arctic, and that's what the United States would like to see, and I don't blame them because that's a vulnerability for the U.S. is the North, because we have to remember, even though we don't think of the map in that way, but if you look at the map from the top, Russia is on the other side of the Arctic Ocean, and so and China is very busy building up its own presence in the Arctic as well, on the Northeast Passage as opposed to the Northwest Passage. So I think there's going to be tremendous opportunities in terms of resources, as you pointed out. In fact, we have lots of opportunities in resources, but we're not taking advantage of it in Canada because of our regulatory system. That goes back to the point about regulation. And that's, the Impact Assessment Act has not only been disastrous for the oil and gas sector, but it's also disastrous for the mining sector in terms of what's required and things like that. And we haven't had a major mining project being developed in Canada for quite some time. And so we have some great opportunities on the resource side. And I think that's actually one of the most important changes, as I like to call it, big bang changes that we need to make in order to grow the Canadian economy. In fact, I end my article for tomorrow that it's going to be on the Trump tariffs by saying that we should make a deal, but building a really strong economy is the best way of thumbing our nose at Trump.
Well, you underscored a point that we've been making for some time, is Canada has extraordinary opportunity that seems to have been neglected. We've almost been our own worst enemy in constraining the economic opportunities, whether it be our energy infrastructure, mining in the north, water, minerals, you name it. I'm going to shift back to the US for a moment. One can't help but feel the US has violated in many ways and many times the North American trade agreement. Clearly, it needs to be renegotiated and trust restored. Does the US even understand the mutual interests of its neighbor to the north? What is it that Canada has as leverage in future negotiations? Is the US going to listen? Is Canada a minor player, simply a buffer for defense, or do they really understand the economic integration and the economic opportunities that can be realized in its relations with Canada?
Well, I think one of the pieces of good news yesterday was the fact that 4 Republicans voted with the Democrats to pass a motion that Trump should not be imposing tariffs on Canada. There's a lot of goodwill towards Canada from many Americans, and they don't. We've always been taken for granted, but I think that generally, I don't think outside of South Park, trying to having a military conquest of Canada, I don't think that's ever been seriously on the cards. But we do have responsibilities, and we've always had trade irritants with the Americans. In fact, I read the document that the United States Trade Representative put out 2 days ago, listing all the complaints they had of various countries. There's about 10 pages on Canada. The number one item, not surprising, supply management, that the Americans are very angry about and have been for some time. But there's a whole bunch of other things listed. In fact, quite surprisingly, a lot of them introduced by the Liberals in the past 10 years. Things like the Online Harms Act, which is requiring organizations in the United States to bargain with newspapers in Canada. They're not happy about that. They're not happy about the digital services tax that we put on, which mainly affects the big digital companies from the United States. So they call it a tariff, although it's in principle not a tariff, but it is. But in the end, it acts like a tariff. They're not happy about the Streaming Act. The Streaming Act is a 5% tax on streamers that goes into paying for Canadian content in the media. So it's another form of taxation. So they've listed a number of things in that. By the way, I was surprised by some things not included, like lumber. Americans have always been unhappy over our stumpage fees, especially in British Columbia, that are set relatively low. And so they've complained about that. That's been an ongoing issue for almost over 100 years. But the point is that, we have a lot of these trade irritants, but they're not major. When I read the 10 pages, I said, this is not worth reciprocal tariffs. I mean, there's nothing big here. There are things that could get corrected in a deal. So I think we can fix things on a deal with the United States. I think Mexico also wants to have a deal made to maintain the North American economy. And we have to remember the tariffs on autos by Trump is going to have a huge impact on the auto industry. And the automakers are definitely at Trump right now that you're going to not just hurt production in Canada and Mexico, you're not necessarily going to draw it here because of the increased costs now that we're going to have to face. Because we have to remember trade, often is done because people are finding it cheaper to produce something elsewhere and bring it into your country. And that helps keep costs down for consumers, which we keep forgetting about. And it's the impact of the tariffs, of course, is going to be to make things more expensive for consumers, but it is going to make it also less competitive for certain companies to operate, especially if they're trying to operate in other parts of the world at the same time.
I'm going to open a discussion up with the viewers. I've really got one more question for you. No, I'll pose two questions. Aslam on the side has talked about defense spending, which we focused on earlier when we referred to the peace dividend. And he's made note of something I've been very, very curious about over time, and that is Trump negotiating with Russia to see if he can cool down the reasons for defense? Is it conceivable that the world could, in fact, actually achieve some degree of peace and thereby reduce the need for this defense spending that seems to be rampant? Is the military-industrial complex become a problem of wanting to continue to fester these international tensions, driving the defense industry itself?
Well, I think you know, I'm not an expert entirely on this, but there's a couple of observations to be made. Um, During the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as well as supporting Israel vis-a-vis the Iranian government and Iran and its proxies, the U.S. was having to produce a lot of armaments for both situations, and they were running out. That was actually one of the reasons Biden slowed down some of the production of armaments and not sending it to Israel. And Israel was wondering whether he was actually undercutting support for Israel doing that. But there was a problem with armaments, and I think that's why I think, and Trump has said this. I've heard him say this. He has said that Asia is their big issue, and that Europe has to do more vis-a-vis dealing with Russia and spend money to support that. And I think he will still continue his role in the Middle East. He seems to have a lot of interest in that. So I think my point is that, I'm not sure it's a matter of reducing military expenditure as much as not having to ramp it up as more in the future that the Americans are concerned about it. And that's why they want other countries to spend more money, the NATO partners, on defense rather than the U.S. doing it entirely. And I think that can be well understood, especially when you have some laggards, including Canada, which is spending, I think was at one point, I forget, 7% of GDP on military. We're actually I think sixth or seventh lowest of the NATO partners. So, we don't have very good, we're not helping along very well. And in fact, by military spending, defense, I was around the table at the time Paul Martin was Minister of Finance, and there was always talk about supporting the military more, but in the end, there was always a greater desire to spend money on education or R&D, at universities, or whatever other healthcare, whatever other priorities were important to the federal government.
Do you think Canada could benefit by having a Doge of its own?
Yes, I mean, you can't call it Doge because it comes with a bad name, but I think people would be very supportive of it, seeing some major looks and drive some efficiency in the government of Canada, especially.
Well, I was thinking recently that our taxing system at the municipal level anyway, which is provincially imposed, is based on supply. How much money gets collected, and therefore how can we spend it, as opposed to needs driven, and flipping it to the point that municipalities are held accountable to only be providing needs versus wishes and wants. It completely flips the equation from one of being, we got to come up with ideas on how to spend all this tax revenue, to one that says we've got to really be focused on what the needs are and whether or not we ever fulfill those needs and then start cutting back on expenditures.
Yeah. And there's been quite rapid increases in property taxes the past several years.
Right.
Yeah, and not just in Alberta. Right?
One last question. If you were sitting down with Donald Trump today, is there a question or a comment you'd like to share with him?
I noticed he changed his hair color. He's gone gray.
Yeah, it looks a little whiter, didn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll pose that. We've got two candidates for prime minister, or three, or four, or whatever. Is there any comment or question you would think we should be posing to a primarial candidate at this point?
Well, I think the biggest one is, how are you really going to shock the Canadian economy and make it grow better? We've had a terrible decade.
Right.
GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, has been stagnant. We have fallen way behind other countries. In fact, we're now lower than the OECD average for the first time in decades. We're about now 70% of the U.S. levels, which is terrible. which means that our best and brightest are going to move down to the United States. In fact, already a lot of young people, they can't get a house in Canada. They can't. It's too expensive. They don't get the incomes to work. I'm seeing this even with my own grandkids. My oldest one's going to university next year, and even he's thinking might be better going off to the United States, where things look better. So we have to really fix this economy, and I think, as you mentioned, Perry, the tariffs, I think, has now woken up Canada that we have to do better. So I'd like to know from the candidates what they're going to really do. Now I know some of the things. I've heard it from Pierre Poilievre what he would do on the resource side, and I hear from Carney how he's going to build 500,000 homes a year, which I believe. I'll believe that when it let's say is when it's 30 degrees during wintertime in Alberta. But anyway.
Well, so the economy didn't take care of itself. Okay, Eric, your turn.
Thanks for that, Jack. I have two questions. One related to retaliatory tariffs, and I've seen a bunch of the numbers and why it doesn't make sense. From your perspective, if a country like Canada feels attacked and they want to respond, what's a better response than a retaliatory tariff? And the second one is does the guns and butter argument or position change when we factor in dual use technologies and changing mindsets to a whole societal approach to national security, things like comprehensive national defense versus total defense?
Okay. So you have to remind me of the second question after, but with regard to the first one on retaliation, let me just start with a couple of important facts to remember. United States imports from all countries 11% of its GDP. We're about 30% of GDP. so it tells you something right away. The problem putting tariffs on the U.S. imports has very little, except for a few cases, has very little impact on the U.S. It'll get shifted forward. We're heavily exposed to the U.S. market, but I think our trade to the U.S. is roughly around 20% of our GDP is just to the U.S., 33% to the whole world, but it's about roughly. But the U.S. only imports from Canada is like 3 or 4% of their GDP. We put a tariff on, we forget they have a huge domestic market. And so they don't get harmed by the tariff very much, but we get ourselves. And so that's what the studies all show. In fact, tomorrow's my article, I actually talk about just one that came out this week from the United Kingdom, analyzing, what would happen if various scenarios, but one of them was Canada and Mexico retaliate against the United States, as well as China, and what the impact are on all the countries around the world, not just the four of them. But the main point is, when you look at the numbers, U.S. is hurt, but not hurt very much, but we get walloped, losing 5% of our per capita income. So, that's not a small number. So we know that retaliation doesn't work. So to get to your question, is there an alternative? Well, the one that I mentioned is Australia. When the Chinese put on, you remember there was a real tiff between China and Australia back in 2020. Now I forget the reasons why now, but it had to do over something. I forget what happened. It was a more political thing. But the Chinese put on tariffs on Australian goods coming into Australia. Australia did not retaliate. What Australia did is it went around to all the countries and made the case that China was being a bad boy and a very bad partner. And at that time, China wanted to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership and some other trade negotiations, and they didn't like it at all. And so eventually, the whole thing came to an end. Australia did just fine, and they didn't have to shoot themselves in the foot.
Mhm.
If you notice, Mexico last year, or last month, I should say, they initially talked about retaliating against the U.S. government over the first tariffs that were being talked about, and they decided to hold off. We went ahead and we retaliated, but Mexico didn't, and so maybe and so maybe the softer approach and the more realistic one is a better approach than that. So that's my answer to one possible approach, is thinking a little bit more like what the Australians did, and use more diplomacy as a way of trying to deal with the tariffs. The other issue on defense and guns and butter, the old argument about guns versus butter, but butter assumes a fixed amount of resources available, and of course, if you have new technologies that come in, then that could actually be a boost to the economy. It is very interesting that when you look at the history of, by the way, I read a lot of history, so really big into this. But if you read a number of historians, and a good example is Ian Morris from Stanford, who traces the past 10,000 years of human history. One of the key factors he said that explains economic growth has been innovation, of course, but a lot of it is military-induced innovation. In other words, necessity is the mother of innovation. And when you're in military engagement all the time, then you're looking for new things. In fact, even and I remember a friend of mine telling me this because he was involved. When the first portable computer was being constructed, it started with the U.S. military wanting to have a computer that soldiers could carry around, and so they gave a lot of money to Stanford and the Palo Alto area to invent a portable computer, and that's where it came from, military necessity. And so I think that's you'll find that it's a lot of innovations have happened when there's a crisis or when there's a real necessity to do things. And I think your point is right. That could, there could be significant potential gains from some of the innovations that might come about with military developments, if I understood your question correctly.
Jack, there's been some discussion over the last couple of days and in the chat function as well about how these reciprocal tariffs were calculated. I know you've done some work in that regard, trying to determine where these numbers come from. Can you give us some color on what you've learned?
Well, it took me a while to find it last night, but I did. And there is a United States trade representative has a report, and there is a section of this report that says these are how the effective tariff rates were calculated. It's a bit of a mathematical calculation, but they estimate how much of an increase in the tariff rate is needed in order to bring the trade balance or the trade deficit with the country down to zero, assuming there's no impacts in other countries and other or what economists will call general equilibrium impacts. And so it's a formula that is based on, in the end, on looking at in the numerator is the trade. There's a trade surplus number. It's divided by imports, also a factor of which, to what extent putting on a tariff is shifted, that the Americans put on is shifted forward on the foreign country. There's a number for that, and also what's called the elasticity demand for imports, which economists will talk about often, elasticity demand, but it's basically the price sensitivity of imports. So it's a formula, and then they said, well, here's what we think is the elasticity value, and here's what we think is the forward shifting factor for tariffs in terms of how much it's shifted forward as opposed to shifted back onto the United States, and then they had the trade surplus number, and and then that's how they calculated the tariff. It's a little more sophisticated than the way that it's being described by some social media and even the media, which I've seen today. But there is a problem in the whole thing in the first place. That is, this is not necessarily the welfare maximizing tariff rate. If you were going to choose a reciprocal tariff, what would be the optimal one? And to give you an example, especially if you did it unilaterally, there's also people have estimated that if you had retaliation, but there was a paper done, for example, in 2014 that Moran actually referred to, done by some people down in the U.S. And they said, okay, United States is a big country. If they put on a tariff, they can force prices down in other countries because of the size of the U.S. economy. We can't, but the U.S. can. And taking that into account in a very sophisticated model with analyzing all countries at the same time, and et cetera, they estimated that if the United States put on a unilateral tariff, the optimal one would be 20%. And that would be on everybody. They didn't try to calculate it, country by country, but they did have a section where they talked about whether you should have tariffs that vary across countries. And their argument was, yes, you should. It would be better for the U.S. if the tariff rates varied by country. So that's what we got last night, was varied by country, but it was not a model which estimated what I would call from the American point of view, the welfare maximizing tariff rate.
Okay. Jeff, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for your insights. I just wanted to mention the conflict between China and Australia is because the Australians were calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's it. I was trying to remember. I knew there was something, and I should have, because it was 2020, right?
But what I wanted to ask is, so given that the U.S. is becoming a unreliable trade partner, and we're talking about expanding our trade with the rest of the world, and I'm thinking particularly with fossil fuels, I have some friends who say that given the the rate at which we're moving towards renewable energy, that if we build a bunch of pipelines now, they're never going to pay for themselves. And I just would like to get your thoughts on that and how I can respond to them. Because I personally think that, had we gone ahead with Energy East, we would have been able to help the Europeans with getting off of Russian oil and gas. And I think there's still time. And I think that fossil fuels will be around for at least 20 to 30 years.
Well, yeah, I'm no longer on the board of Imperial Oil, but I was on the board of Imperial Oil. First of all, on LNG, there's definitely room for new LNG production units. In fact, the Americans are now that Biden is gone and Trump is saying we're going to improve more LNG exports, they're already starting to put plans together for new ones. We do have one coming out next year that's going to do quite well. And the reason for it is because the price of natural gas in some of the foreign countries is really low. Very high. And there is expense with LNG. It's expensive building an LNG plant in Canada. And then when you ship it across, you have to have the other side going from liquefaction back into gas. So there's another plant there. So there is a certain cost involved. But I haven't looked at it recently, but in Japan and Korea and places like that, China as well, natural gas is selling more like $18, $15 an MCF, while in Canada we're getting 3 or 4. So there's a big margin there to play with. So I think there's definitely some economics behind LNG. Oil is a little more complicated, but right now, we have to remember 90% right now of our gas and oil is sold to the United States. And even the new Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which has 900,000 barrels per day that it could transport, almost all of it is going to the U.S. I think there's only 200,000 barrels per day that's sold elsewhere. And that's because you get better realizations selling to the U.S. And given the transportation costs. But that doesn't mean that you can't make some money. selling it elsewhere. And so there is demand for oil. How long will oil last? Well, I think, first of all, net zero, in my view, by 2015 is a pipe dream. It isn't going to happen. It doesn't mean that we won't have the energy transition. I think we will. But I think there will still be considerable demand for oil for several decades to come. And in fact, India has made it clear they're not going to net zero until 2070. China's 2060. So you already got two big consumers that are not going to net zero. So there is profitability, and who knows what's going to actually happen in the next 30 years. I mean, you can't. I always like to remind people that in 1913, would you have predicted that the next 30 years would be 2 world wars and a Great Depression? In 1913, and I can tell you, I read the book called 1913, and it was a review of different cities across the world and what they were like in 1913, and at that point nobody was talking about potential conflict. So you never know what's going to happen over 30 years, but certainly when you look at kind of reasonable forecasts, there'll be still significant demand for oil, and plus it's even when you go to significant reductions in emissions, there'll still be demand for plastics and demand for a number of oil products. So in the end, I think we can sell more oil abroad. It's too bad we canceled Northern Gateway. It would have already been adding to our GDP this year. Too bad we didn't. We took too long to finish the Trans Mountain expansion. But there's also a value to the Energy East. The whole point of Energy East was to displace the importation of oil in the Atlantic and in eastern Canada. And now actually talking about a national security issue, right now we have oil that goes to Alberta oil that goes to Ontario and Montreal area, and it has to go through the United States back into Ontario and Quebec. And so that's why you put something on like an export tax. Ontario and Quebec will end up paying it too, unless you give a drawback at that point, or something like that. But if the U.S. puts a tariff on oil, it's also going to hit Ontario and Quebec, and especially if we ended up putting another tariff on oil coming from the United States, it could get double hit coming into Ontario, which will never happen. But anyway, we'll probably.
When discussing energy, Jack, and I see OPEC surprised everybody today with their energy supply chain changes. If we hit a sustained economic recession, then the demand for energy collapses. And all this discussion about the possibility of fossil fuels, I mean, we've seen the price of oil go down $5 today as an indication that if the economy globally tanks, nobody's going to want any more LNG. We're going to have an oversupply of fossil fuels.
But Harry, that's always short term. I mean,
okay.
I remember 2020, the pandemic year. I was chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Recovery Council. I remember our first meeting, we were talking about $10 oil. The collapse of markets at that point. You had not only the pandemic, but you had the Russian Saudi price war, and it was really grim. And then at a later time, these things changed, and that's why even if we do have I think we are going to end up with a recession worldwide, induced by the tariffs. There will be a slowdown, but eventually these things correct themselves, and that's.
How long is eventually? I mean, if this is sustained, give me.
I don't think it'll be. People are going to start working on alternatives. Trading relations will change. They may be somewhat higher cost. People forget that tariffs have been around for centuries. In fact, back in the 1800s, they were one of the significant sources of revenue for governments. They were relatively high. In fact, they were even higher than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s. It was only after the Second World War that all of a sudden governments got together and said, let's try to get rid of these trade barriers, and not just tariffs, but also non-trade barriers. And they did bring them down. They didn't eliminate them altogether. And in fact, today there are still many less developed countries that rely a lot on tariffs because it's one of the easiest taxes to collect. Is you can collect something at the border. Because in the informal economy, many less developed countries, you can't run an income tax. You can have a big corporation tax only on big companies, and that's your sources of revenues. Tariffs become very important. And I've worked in countries like Jordan and some others that I can mention, where tariffs were like 25–30% of the government's revenues.
Okay, but those reforms took 10 to 20 years before they finally kicked in, before the world finally took seriously the need for.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have a collapse. I think we should be a little less panicky, but it doesn't mean that we aren't going to have a contraction in the next year, and I think that will happen.
Okay, Mark, I'm sorry, David, you're on, and then Peter, and we'll call it a wrap up then. Go ahead, David.
Hi, Jack. Good to see you again. Jack, in the Depression, infrastructure projects were one of the ways that that government incentivized and put people back to work. In particular, 25% of our youth that are currently struggling to find employment. I'm a huge proponent of government staying out of businesses, but if you were giving advice to whoever the new prime minister is soon, what industry would you incentivize? And is it worthwhile doing another regulatory structure to strongly encourage the east-west, north-south transportation corridors to support industry, not by doing anything for industry, but by making the roads, rails, ports rapidly expanding so we can get our products to market, not just oil, but everything, at the same time supporting national security?
Yes, and yes. So I've been, I've never liked industrial policy. And I don't like governments picking winners from losers. In fact, my argument is governments can't tell winners from losers, but losers are very good at picking governments. And so I don't think, I've never been a fan of this. Many of the things that you hear today about how governments have to pick the industries, that they're going to be the ones of the future and all that sort of stuff. The market will sort things out, but what the market needs, I think, is the right environment. And that's why I'm a big proponent of tax reform. In fact, I have a proposal of a big bang corporate tax reform. For example, just moving to a system where you exempt reinvested earnings in the corporation and only tax the money when it's pulled out of the corporation. It's a paper that's in the School of Public Policy. It's called a tax on distributed profits, but you can also look at it as an exemption of invested earnings. Estonia used it, and to their great benefit, it attracted a lot of companies to Estonia. But also, we know the Irish miracle. One of the big drivers, of course, was moving to a 12.5% corporate tax rate, where nobody else had that at that time. So there's lots of stories that, on the tax reform side that we can do. I have some other ideas on the personal side as well. But I think there's some major things that we can accomplish. I think that we also have, in my view, the regulatory system is absolutely critical. We should be developing a lot more mining projects in this country. Look at the Ring of Fire in Ontario. They can't even get a road built up there with the way things are moving. And we should be having corridors, which Australia has used to a great extent. You put in a corridor that gets approvals of the way for like First Nation issues and certain other political issues, and then after that, you can put in a railway, you can put in transmission lines, whatever, and they'll get their specific project approvals all done within a year. And when I was on the board of Brookfield, for example, years ago, we were able to build a railway in Western Australia within a year because we had it already, the corridor was already approved. And so it was pretty easy to do that. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do. I think maybe that's not the right approach, but going to your point, we could be exporting a lot more if we had, we make sure we have the ports built up and we have the infrastructure built up. And I think even, many workers will be, and labor will be very happy to see that kind of construction. The other the other thing which I think is always going to remain important are things like having a strong education system. Because that also actually that was one of Iran's, or not sorry, Iran, Ireland's policies was to have very strong education, because a lot of people didn't even finish high school, never mind going to tertiary level. So what the Irish did is they really put a big emphasis on education to get people to get their skills, and that was part of that was another important element, as well as building infrastructure, like you pointed out, David. So all those things, we could be doing. Israel is a different story. They built a high tech industry, and it was but they were lucky. They had a huge immigration. They increased the population by 25% in the early 90s from Eastern Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. And they were scientists and engineers. They were very well trained people. So they didn't need training, but the Israelis said, okay, let's give them a little bit of money to make an investment. And they all went into high tech, and they built up this amazingly innovative market. But they also did a number of other policies to encourage innovation, including fixing up capital gains taxes. There were a lot of rigidities in the Israeli system, and they undertook a lot of reforms to make it a much more flexible economy. So these are all examples, but I think that's what we have to do now, Canada. We cannot repeat the last decade.
Thank you for that question, David. And I think, Jack, that summary was outstanding. Peter, you've got the wrap up. Go ahead. What question do you have?
Well, thank you, Perry, and Jack. That was a very interesting presentation. I appreciate it very much. I have a comment and a question. So the comment I'll start with, because just to add to the question that Jeff asked about pipelines, I'm of the view, this is my personal view, that we should pay for pipelines now because we're going to need them for water before the end of the century. So that's my comment about the link to the polycrisis of the environment. My question, though, Jack, is are the rules of origin relevant at all in Trump's circle in terms of how they set tariff rates? Or anything in terms of how they decide how to split?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm not sure in the reciprocal tariffs and the universal tariff, the 10% rules of origin are going to be relevant. That I don't know. So I can't answer that because that's probably one of the complexities to try to understand what they did. It all came out last night, so
Yes.
whatever is available is available. But we do know that in the case of both the auto and potash tariffs that we're now being taxed on, anything that comes under CUSMA, the Canadian-U.S. Mexican agreement, is exempt.
Yeah.
So there's a rule. The rules of origin play a role in that, right? In terms of what determines content under it. So it's quite relevant in that case. But I'm not sure about the reciprocal tariffs.
Yes, I was thinking in particular because of the ones he's now imposed on many countries around the world, and they vary quite widely from 10% or so to almost 50%.
No, that's right. Well, actually, I think some are even higher than 50%, if I recall.
Thanks, Peter, for that question. Thank you,
thank
Jack,
you.
so much. I can't say, well, I will say on behalf of all of us, thank you for the time that you've given us today. Thank you for insights. Keep on writing. It's always interesting to see what you're expressing. But clearly the world, in the face of this reset, is going to go through a transition. We talk oftenly in our webinars and our newsletters about the forces and sources of change, often focusing on technology. But in this instance, a geopolitical event. And it is pause for concern, and it's certainly pause for adjustment. Hopefully Canada will take it seriously and find the silver lining in all this. And you've given us some hints of the things that we might pursue. So again, thank you, Jack, and stay in touch.